Okay.
Ito na. Play ko na yung song.
Bakit ako narito? Tila dulo na ng mundo, ng bayan kong pulo-pulo. Parang sumabog na bato. Bakit ako naglakbay? Dala itong mga aral, mga teoryang gumagabay. Karanasang pinabaybay. Narito ako para sa pagkakaisa, pagsulong. Narito ako para sa pagwawasto, pagtaluyong. Narito ako para ang kalat-kalat na mulo magiging buo na buo.
Ano palitawin yung sagot? Natakpan.
Ano sagot?
Nung nagpatugtog, lumabas ito. Ano?
Okay.
Ating hinahanap ang wastong
Ayun, ano
paglalaban,
yun
Ito po
ang pagpuno at pagtupad sa masang mabalikwas. Narito tayo para sa pagkakaisa, pagsulong. Narito tayo para sa pagwawasto, pagtaluyong. Narito tayo para ang kalat-kalat na mulo magiging buo na buo. Pagkakaisa, paglaban, tagumpay sa ating bayan ay ang pagsasaigdigan, paglaya ng sangkatauhan. Narito tayo para sa pagkakaisa, pagsulong. Narito tayo para sa masang aping Pilipino. Narito tayo para ang kalat-kalat na mulo magiging buo na buo. Narito tayo para sa pagkakaisa, pagsulong. Narito tayo para sa masang aping Pilipino. Narito tayo para ang kalat-kalat na mulo magiging buo na buo. Ito ang dakilang misyon ng Pilipinong proletaryo. Bakit ako narito? Tila dulo na ng mundo, ng bayan kong pulo-pulo. Parang sumabog na bato. Bakit ako naglakbay? Dala itong mga aral, mga teoryang gumagabay.
Sino pagkadalang? Elmo.
Ito po pauna ko
Narito ako para sa pagkakaisa, pagsulong. Narito ako para sa pagwawasto, pagtaluyong. Narito ako para ang kalat-kalat na mulo magiging buo na buo. ang wastong paglalakad ng pamumuno at pagtupad sa masang bumabalikwak.
Hi, welcome everyone to our special edition of the ND Line Online School today in commemoration of martial law. Today we are discussing the struggle against the Marcos fascist dictatorship with Tito Joe. Hello, Tito Joe. How are you?
I'm fine. Warmest greetings to you, Edna, and to all our listeners.
So, even before Marcos proclaimed martial law in 1972, revolutionary forces in the Philippines had been waging the National Democratic Revolution. How big was this movement before martial law?
In the entire 1960s, the National Democratic Movement against U.S. imperialism and the local reactionary classes of big compradors, landlords, and bureaucrat capitalists grew steadily among the student youth, workers, and peasants through activities to arouse, organize, and mobilize them. The Student Cultural Association of the University of the Philippines, or the SCAUP, made the first major mass action in the struggle for national democracy when it led 5,000 students on March 15, 1961, to scuttle the anti-communist hearings of the Committee on Anti-Philippine Activities of the lower house of Congress. Those hearings had persecuted the faculty members and student activists of the University of the Philippines for writing patriotic and progressive essays. The leading activists of the SCAUP subsequently generated study groups and seminars to promote the national democratic line of resuming the Philippine Revolution among the students, young workers, peasants, and professionals. They established the Kabatang Makabayan as a comprehensive youth organization in 1964. The KM gained national prominence as an articulator and militant force of the National Democratic Movement in 1964. It worked with student organizations, labor federations of Lapiang Manggagawa, and the Masaka led by Felixberto Olalla. It spearheaded demonstrations that peaked with 25,000 rallies in 1965 against the treaties, agreements, and arrangements that bound the Philippines as a semi-colony to the U.S. It also led the youth demonstration against the so-called Manila Summit, in which U.S. President Lyndon Johnson rounded up the Asian puppet governments to join the U.S. in its war of aggression against Vietnam. The demonstration was violently dispersed, but the student demonstrators were inspired to launch the October 24th movement for carrying out social investigation and recruiting the youth in the urban and rural poor communities. In 1967 to 68, the KM led nationwide student strikes against reactionary school owners and administrators and built school chapters nationwide. In 1969, the KM cooperated with jeepney drivers to carry out transport strikes against rising oil prices. In the meantime, the Communist Party of the Philippines was established under the guidance of Marxism-Leninism with Mao Zedong thought, with only 12 delegates representing more than 100 charter members. And it soon established the New People's Army on March 29, 1969, with only a few squads in Tarlac, but with a mass base of some 80,000 people. The first quarter storm of 1970, led by the KM, broke out um, from January to March. Um, in 1970, it was a series of mass protests that surged with 100,000 to 200,000 youth and workers joining each protest action. As a result, the National Democratic mass organizations increased their membership by leaps and bounds. The violent dispersal of the mass actions, which resulted in the killing and injury of mass protesters, only served to arouse popular outrage, inspire further mass actions, drove many activists to study revolutionary theory and practice, and emboldened many activists to join the CPP and NPA. The mass protests continued despite the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in 1971 until the declaration of the martial law in 1972. Against the strident threats of Marcos to declare martial law, the mass protesters shouted "People's War" as the answer to martial law. On the eve of the declaration of martial law, the KM had a membership of 15,000. The revolutionary trade unions reached a membership of at least 30,000, and the peasant mass base was at least 200,000, mainly in Tarlac, Pampanga, Ifugao, Cagayan, Isabela, and Nueva Vizcaya provinces in 1972. The CPP membership was approaching 2,000, and the NPA had some 300 Red Fighters with automatic rifles, excluding the People's Militia with inferior weapons. Marcos exaggerated the number of NPA fighters as 10,000 in his declaration of martial law.
Thank you. So it seems like this is another example of how the youth are so important. Could you please tell us more about the first quarter storm? What were the significant mass actions and what did they achieve?
Metro Manila was the center of the FQS of 1970, but these spread nationwide. As I have already said, the mass actions ranged in size from 100,000 to 200,000. The storm broke out when Marcos ordered the violent dispersal of the students gathered before Congress after he delivered his State of the Nation address on January 26, 1970. The violent dispersal and the death and injury of the student demonstrators provoked further mass actions. The subsequent mass actions involved having assembly points in various parts of Metro Manila, and then the demonstrators marched from those points, picking up more demonstrators and mass support along the way before converging on Congress, the Presidential Palace, or the U.S. Embassy. Following the violent dispersal of the rally before Congress on January 26, 1970, the KM mobilized 150,000 demonstrators to march to the Presidential Palace on January 30. The Presidential Guards and Marines attacked the demonstrators, and the demonstrators captured a fire truck to ram through the gate of the palace. A seesaw battle ensued on the Menjola Bridge, resulting in serious casualties on the side of the students and the reactionary side. Marcos pleaded to the movement for a democratic Philippines to stop the mass actions, but the KM decided that the mass movement must go on. The next demonstration in February gathered at Plaza Miranda in Quiapo, Manila, and then proceeded to the U.S. Embassy. The demonstrators broke into the gate of the embassy and vented their ire on the entire ground floor of the embassy. The mass movement proceeded with major issues raised against U.S. imperialism and the Marcos puppet regime. After the first quarter storm, more demonstrations occurred on labor and land reform issues, as well as on the U.S. military bases and the U.S. war of aggression against Vietnam until the declaration of martial law.
So what was the effect of martial law on this national democratic movement?
The martial law declaration of 1972 served to inflame the revolutionary spirit of the Filipino people. They were outraged that Marcos was imposing fascist dictatorship on them in the service of U.S. imperialism and his own selfish interests, despite his propaganda of saving the republic and building a new society. Marcos outlawed all the legal forces of the National Democratic Movement and engaged in the mass arrest of their leaders, as well as the leaders of the opposition Liberal Party. The mass activists who could not be arrested went underground. In Metro Manila alone, 4,000 mass activists went underground with the intention of joining the People's War in the countryside. The CPP membership leaped to more than 2,000. By 1974, most of the thousands of activists joining the urban underground were deployed nationwide to help build the party, the NPA, the revolutionary mass organizations, and the local organs of political power in so many regions nationwide. Instead of being able to destroy the legal national democratic movement with martial law and fascist dictatorship, Marcos unwittingly succeeded in helping the armed revolutionary movement by driving the mass activists from the ranks of the workers and educated youth to join the CPP, NPA, and the peasant masses in the countryside.
So, Tito, what were the different forms of resistance against the Marcos fascist dictatorship?
Despite the violence and terrorism of martial law, various forms of legal and illegal resistance were possible against the Marcos fascist dictatorship. Only those threatened with arrest, torture, and death had to go underground. The civil rights and religious organizations tried their best to defend the human rights of the social activists, the disemployed print and broadcast journalists who were thrown out of their jobs, the trade unionists and leaders of the conservative opposition. There was no way Marcos could stop the patriotic and democratic forces among the workers, peasants, students, professionals, religious people, and the legal opposition parties who carried on their daily work to express their views and among themselves, especially because Marcos insulted everyone by closing all mass media that were not under his control and by trying to monopolize information. The National Democratic Front of the Philippines was formed on April 24, 1973, to build and strengthen the broad united front against the Marcos fascist dictatorship. This united front was successful in coordinating the legal forms of resistance and the armed revolutionary movement. Anti-fascist publications circulated, enlightening protest actions occurred. Under conditions of martial law, both legal forms of struggle and the People's War flourished. That was why the Marcos fascist dictatorship was ultimately overthrown. In class terms, the working class, as the leading class, relied mainly on its basic alliance with the peasant masses, won over the middle social strata, and took advantage of the splits among the reactionaries in order to isolate and destroy the power of the Marcos fascist regime.
So the Bangsamoro, led by the Moro National Liberation Front, also waged armed struggle against the Marcos dictatorship. Was there an alliance between the CPP and the MNLF? What was their relationship?
Nur Mizwari and other leaders of the Moro National Liberation Front got their political education and training from Kabatang Makabayan, which propagated the right of national self-determination among all indigenous peoples in the Philippines. There was therefore a high level of common understanding between the MNLF and the revolutionary movement of the entire Filipino people. There was at least an objective alliance between the MNLF and the revolutionary movement of the entire Filipino people in fighting the reactionary Manila-based government as the common enemy. The Moro nation's fight for self-determination had the effect of helping the revolutionary struggle of the entire Filipino people. Reciprocally, the struggle of the Filipino people helped the Moro people. The CPP and all patriotic and democratic forces succeeded in countering the attempt of Marcos to use Christian chauvinism against the MNLF, the IMLF, and the Moro nation. The NDFP and the Christians for National Liberation advocated ecumenism and mutual respect between the Christian and Islamic believers. The military minions of Marcos committed atrocities against the Moro people, but were condemned by the Filipino people for doing so. The NDFP and the MNLF agreed to stand together as complainants on behalf of the Filipino and Moro peoples against the Marcos fascist dictatorship as defendant in the trial conducted by the International People's Tribunal in Antwerp, Belgium in 1980. Marcos and his criminal accomplices were convicted by the International People's Court.
Was there international support in the movement against the fascist dictatorship? And if so, what kind and what was its significance?
There was abundant international support for the Filipino people and the just struggle against the Marcos fascist dictatorship. As early as 1969, we in the CPP anticipated that Marcos would impose fascist dictatorship on the people. Thus, we started to deploy cadres to conduct solidarity work in socialist countries, in certain countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, in the US, Europe, and in the Asia Pacific region. The CPP formed committees and branches in whichever country it had party members. These engaged in mass work in order to build Filipino community organizations and solidarity organizations with the host people. The NDFP also had its international political work. It was able to form alliances of Filipino organizations and solidarity organizations and develop diplomatic and proto-diplomatic relations with foreign governments and their agencies. The CPP and the NDFP were open to alliance and cooperation with all Filipino organizations in opposition to the Marcos fascist regime, even if they belonged to the conservative opposition. The national democratic organizations abroad were themselves alliances and could include Filipinos of various ideological, religious, and political persuasions, as long as they agreed to fight against the Marcos fascist dictatorship.
The assassination of Aquino in 1983 upon his return to Manila triggered an anti-fascist upsurge. How significant was this in the overthrow of the Marcos fascist dictatorship?
The Aquino assassination on August 21, 1983, triggered the gigantic mass actions that led to the overthrow of the Marcos fascist dictatorship in 1986. That was the biggest mistake of Marcos. It led to the firm conclusion of the US government that Marcos had become more of a liability than an asset to US interest. The US State Department and the Republican Democratic parties were offended that Marcos resorted to murder to eliminate a political rival they thought could replace Marcos in a peaceful way. The Catholic and other Christian churches were also offended. So were most sections of the big comprador and landlord classes that had long been offended by Marcos and his upstart cronies for engaging in flagrant plunder, monopolizing the infrastructure projects, and grabbing the enterprises and assets of others. The Ninoy Aquino funeral was attended by 1 million people, but the pro-Aquino forces did not have solid mass organizations for launching mass protest. In the interest of the broad united front against the Marcos fascist dictatorship, the forces of the National Democratic Movement cooperated with the pro-Aquino forces in mobilizing the masses in great numbers to seek justice and effect the overthrow of the Marcos fascist dictatorship.
Could you tell us about the EDSA uprising? How did it happen and what effect did it have? How did the regime respond to it?
The biggest contradiction between the Filipino people and the Marcos fascist dictatorship became conspicuous with the rise of the mass actions after the Aquino assassination from 1983 to 1986 and the electoral rallies of the opposition during the campaign period for the presidential snap election of February 7, 1986. As a result of the electoral cheating of Marcos through his control of the COMELEC, the CPP immediately announced intensified armed resistance. The legal democratic forces also announced the intensification of mass protest. Subsequently, Cory Aquino announced a campaign of civil disobedience, and the Catholic bishops issued a pastoral letter proclaiming the Marcos regime as having no legal and moral foundation. The stage was set for unprecedented mass actions against the Marcos fascist regime. Meanwhile, the contradictions between the Marcos side and General Baer on one side and Defense Secretary Enrile and General Ramos on the other side broke out into the open. The former side was able to foil the coup attempt of the the AFP, Armed Forces of the Philippines movement, or RAM, as the instrument of the latter side. From Camp Aguinaldo, The Enrile Ramos side and the RAM called for public support before they walked over to Camp Crame. Cardinal Sin called for public support for the beleaguered military opponents of Marcos and Ber. Using the Radio Veritas broadcast station of the Catholics, Boots Aquino, Ninoy Aquino's brother, called on the people to assemble at the Isitan along EDSA. The forces of Bayan and Justice for Aquino and Justice for All were the first to appear in significant number. Thus, the great number of people started to build up along EDSA. Colonel Santiago called for volunteers to accompany him in seizing the broadcast station of Canlaon Broadcasting, KBN, Canlaon Broadcast Network, and the government broadcast facilities. And 500 members of Bayan Quezon City accompanied him. The people who occupied EDSA from Cubao, Quezon City to Makati picked to as high as 2 million people to block the Marcos loyalists from attacking the Enrile Ramos side. Some 80% of the people responded to the calls of Cardinal Sin using the Veritas broadcast station and another Catholic broadcast facility, the Asia Communications Foundation. And 20% of the people were mobilized by Bayan. In the direct encirclement of the Malacanang Palace, more than 90% of the 100,000 people were mobilized by Kilusang Mayo Uno and the League of Filipino Students. Marcos and Ber tried to use force against the Enrile Marcos side, but the gigantic mass of people along EDSA and around the palace was insurmountable. They blocked the army and marine convoys sent out by Marcos from Fort Bonifacio. At the same time, the U.S. Embassy used General Ileto to neutralize the Marcos loyalists in the Philippine Army. He and U.S. Ambassador Bosworth remanded the orders of Marcos for the artillery bombardment on Camp Crame from the site of Imelda's Ministry of Human Settlements. Air Force General Sotelo of Camp Basa Air Base was ordered to bomb Camp Crame, but instead he defected to the Enrile Ramos side. At the end of his power, Marcos and his family had no choice but to be airlifted by U.S. helicopters to the Clark Air Base, and from there to Guam and further on to Hawaii. If Marcos took the road to escape from the palace, he would have been ambushed by one of the special platoons which had been deployed by the New People's Army in Manila.
What was the role of the National Democratic Movement in the EDSA uprising?
I have already pointed out the particular role of the forces of the National Democratic Movement in joining the great number of people at EDSA and seizing the broadcast facilities of KBN and the government and the encirclement of the presidential palace in the final days of Marcos in power from February 22 to 25, 1986. I have not yet mentioned many other important contributions of Bayan, like their organizations in several regions and provinces, building the United Front against Marcos and persuading pro-Marcos politicians and units of the AFP and Philippine Constabulary to withdraw support from Marcos. Bayan organizations were then extensive. The regional commander of the PC, General De Villa in Bicol, cooperated with Bayan in neutralizing the pro-Marcos politicians in the Bicol region. The Bayan organizations of Angeles City blocked the way of the convoy of Marcos loyalist troops headed by General Palafox coming from Camp Aquino in Tarlac. But the biggest role of the National Democratic Movement in ultimately bringing down the Marcos fascist regime was its long, resolute, and active resistance in the legal forms of struggle, as well as in the form of the People's War. As the Marcos fascist dictatorship reigned long and had the illusion of ruling forever, the CPP, NPA, NDFP, the revolutionary mass organizations and local organs of political power, excuse me, may technical problem. These forces of the revolutionary movement grew in strength and spread nationwide. Next page. The legal democratic forces were outlawed and had to go underground, but they kept on launching lightning protest mass actions, and new legal mass organizations also kept on arising, especially after Marcos pretended to lift martial law in 1981. However, as early as 1974 to 1975, the trade unions were able to carry out a nationwide strike in 300 workplaces. And in 1976, the student masses were already able to reestablish student councils in the UP and so many other schools. The People's War was inspirational to the broad masses of the people during all the time that Marcos rode roughshod over them with his armed minions and with US imperial support. The heroic resistance of the CPP, NPA, NDFP, actually, the revolutionary mass organizations and the local organs of political power demonstrated to the broad masses of the people that it was possible to fight the fascist regime. The inspiration of the revolutionary forces became even stronger when the economic, social, and political crisis of the fascist regime and the suffering of the people became conspicuous from 1979 onwards. The budgetary and trade deficits were widening and international credit for the regime was tightening.
Salamat, Tito. It was a time of social unrest and political instability. Why was the revolutionary movement not able to seize political power from Marcos at that time?
As of November 1985, when the plenum of the CPP Central Committee convened, the New People's Army had already accumulated a total of 5,600 high-powered rifles and was already operating nationwide in so many guerrilla fronts in all rural regions and in the majority of Philippine provinces. That was not a small achievement from having only a few squads with only 9 automatic rifles and 26 inferior firearms in 1969. But the strength of the NPA was not yet enough for destroying the armed strength of the enemy and seizing political power in the cities. The advance of the NPA would have been more rapid if not for the subjectivist line gaining currency within CPP in 1981. Uh, that the Philippines was no longer semi-feudal, but industrial capitalist, and that was wrong to follow the strategic line of protracted people's war, of availing of the peasantry and the country as the social and physical terrain for maneuvering against a militarily superior enemy and for accumulating armed strength from stage to stage and from face to face in every stage. The subjectivist line led to the right opportunist line of turning the NDFP into a reformist united front by ending the class leadership of the proletariat, supposedly to attract more people to the NDFP. But the worst political errors resulting from the subjectivist line were several left opportunist lines of insurrectionism in several regions at several times. These insurrectionist errors resulted in severe losses of mass base and worse in the commission of crimes when the failure of line became a pretext for the so-called anti-DPA or deep penetration agent witch hunts. The second great rectification movement of 1992 to 1998 dealt with and rectified these errors and crimes through ideological and political education. The Trotskyite urban insurrectionism of Popoy Lagman in the Manila Rizal region presumed that was enough for the workers to seize political power in order to win the entire Philippine Revolution. And in Mindanao, the Reyes Kimpo Trotskyite red area, white area strategy presumed the people's strike so-called and armed city partisan warfare were the lead factor of the armed revolution, with the NPA a secondary factor trying to catch up with the urban actions by rapidly organizing companies, military companies in an absolutely vertical way without sufficient horizontal deployment of armed units for mass work and mass base building.
So you were part of the struggle against the Marcos dictatorship, diba? Can you share with us your experiences in participating in this struggle?
I'm happy that I was able to contribute what I could to the ideological, political, and organizational development of the revolutionary forces that struggled against the Marcos dictatorship. I took part in the development of labor, peasant, and youth organizations and alliances during the entire 1960s. These led to the founding and development of the CPP, NPA, NDFP, revolutionary mass organizations, and local organs of political power. I was in the preparation of the revolutionary forces that anticipated the emergence of fascist dictatorship. From 1969 to 1972, I was already involved in the People's War against the increasing military actions of the Marcos regime against the people. And from 1972 to my capture in 1977, I fought what was blatantly a fascist dictatorship. Together with many comrades, I faced the tremendous odds, dangers, and risks to life, limb, and liberty, and became tempered by overcoming them in the course of struggle. Even while I was under maximum military detention, I continued to fight in the best way I could up to my release. After the down, uh, Up to the time I was released after the downfall of Marcos in 1986, I was confident that the revolutionary comrades and the masses outside of prison were doing their best in advancing the revolutionary struggle according to the founding principles and strategy and tactics already laid. I was conscious of fighting from inside prison to demonstrate to the people outside that if I could fight under extremely limited conditions, they could fight the enemy even more and better. I was never discouraged by the various forms of physical and mental torture inflicted on me. These only strengthened my determination to fight. Since I went out of prison in 1986, I've continued to be guided by the revolutionary principles and to do the best that I could. I have been able to do ideological, political, and organizational work to the best of my ability. By being a refugee abroad for a long time and no longer of the age for military combat, I can share my accumulated knowledge and experience with the people in order to offer lessons that they can study and learn from. Thus, I keep on doing research, writing, and participating in study sessions like this webinar. We should be cognizant of the fact that it is now the task of much younger comrades to take advantage of the ever worsening chronic crisis of the semi colonial and semi feudal ruling system, the nationwide spread of the revolutionary movement, and the deep roots of the revolutionary forces among the exploited masses. They can be more daring in the revolutionary struggle and accelerate the offensives to mature the strategic defensive, move into the strategic stalemate as soon as possible, and advance to the strategic offensive on time for the unraveling of neoliberalism, the rising tide of the anti-imperialist and democratic struggles, and the resurgence of the world proletarian revolution.
Maraming salamat. Thank you, Tito Joe. So that was our last question for now. We will be opening the floor for questions. If anyone in the audience has a question, just write a comment below and we will answer the question shortly after the break.
Proclamation number 1081, placing the entire Philippines under martial law.
Unang question mamaya. What is the direct aftermath?
Naalala niyo po ba kung nasaan po kayo nung martial law po?
Nagtuturo ako sa Asian Institute of Management. Magising ko sa umaga, lahat ng radyo off.
There was no newspaper, no TV. I was at home. And then people were scared
Yan yung
Nasa US ako. Sabi
pinapalabas
pa
sa
ng ibang mga kasamahan ko,
Hmm.
walang umuwi. Ay,
8
nakakatakot ang
minutes po
martial
ang
law.
break.
Ah.
8 minutes.
Okay, nasa underground na.
Mabuti maganda
I
yun.
was 23.
Mga 20 years old lang ako noon.
Ano, 25.
25 po.
Kung ano po ba yung personal niyo po na naranasan under martial law, kung gaano po kahirap yung panahon po na yun.
Niread yung bahay namin noong April 4, 1973.
Walang katanong-tanong, umabot na kagad yung hataw ng baril, yung suntok, yung sipa, at saka yung sigaw na, dapa, dapa, dapa.
Kaya sabi ko, sino kayo? Sabi niya, Manila Police Intelligence daw sila.
Nilagay ako sa isang room na walang bintana. Tapos naka-chain ako sa bed. Practically everyday, tinorture ako eh.
I was ordered to remove my pants at pilit nilang pinasukan ng ting-ting ang aking penis.
Pinilit akong rin yung aking bulusa. At doon, nilagay nila yung wire dito sa aking dito sa suso ko. Na napakasakit masyado. At
nakatakas ako. Si Lily, pinag-initan nila yung kapatid kong babae na pinatay nila. Inano nga siya inautopsy, pero yung brain niya nandito na sa digestive system. Binaboy nila si Lily. Hindi ko rin siya napuntahan na sa burol niya. Kasi nahanap nga kami ng kuya ko. Tapos shoot to kill ang order sa akin noon.
Kung mababalik niyo po yung oras, may gusto po ba kayong baguhin sa mga naging desisyon niyo, sa mga ginawa niyo?
hindi ako nagsisisi na nangyari sa akin yun eh. Eh kung babalikan ko pa rin, gagawin ko pa rin yun eh.
It's the same path that I would take.
After all these years, napatunayan din na yung ginagawa ko noon, tama rin yun.
Dapat may lumaban talaga kasi kung hindi, kawawa ang bayan natin. Lagi tayong inaapi-api na lamang.
Kung meron po ba kayong maipapayo sa mga kabataan ngayon, ano po yun?
Kahit saan ako pumunta sa mga kabataan, nagsasalita ako, sinasabi ko lagi na never again to martial law.
Applicable pa rin yung sinasabi ng mga matatanda. Ang hindi lumingon sa pinanggalingan ay hindi makararating sa paroroonan. Kung hindi natin matututunan ang mga leksyon ng kasaysayan, mauulit natin ang mga pangyayaring hindi na dapat maulit.
Kami ang mga naglamay sa gabi para masilayan ninyo ang isang magandang araw.
And so as I now sign this proclamation in full view of our nation and the world at large, I am profoundly conscious of the tasks that remain, hoping that we shall not lose the momentum of our achievements so that those who shall come after us may carry the quest of a greater, a brighter world, a new society. I pray now and I ask you to pray with me, as I prayed 8 years ago, that I am doing, that we are doing the right thing by our people. For the end of martial law does not mean the end of our efforts, of our needed reforms, of our struggles, of our sacrifices. The passing of the martial necessity does not carry with it the passing of all the burdens, especially the heavy ones. There will be more tests for our capacity, for our resiliency, our strength as a people. Together we must pass these tests, surmount all crises. And so, as I have said, I sign in your presence, proclaiming the termination of the state of martial law throughout the Philippines. I say, we have just begun. I will now read the dispositive portion of this decree. Now therefore, I, Ferdinand E. Marcos, President, Prime Minister of the Philippines, by virtue of the powers vested in me by the Constitution, do hereby revoke Proclamation 1081, proclaiming a state of martial law in the Philippines, and Proclamation number 1104, dated January 17, 1973, declaring the continuation of martial law and proclaiming the termination of the state of martial law throughout the Philippines, provided that the call to the armed forces of the Philippines to prevent or suppress lawless violence, insurrection, rebellion, and subversion shall continue to be in force and effect, and provided that in the two autonomous regions in Mindanao, upon the request of the residents thereof, the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall continue, and in other places, the suspension of the privilege of the writ shall also continue with respect to persons at present detained, as well as others who may hereafter be similarly detained for the crimes of insurrection or rebellion, subversion, conspiracy, or proposal to commit such crimes, and for all other crimes and offenses committed by them in furtherance or in the occasion thereof, or incident thereof, or in connection therewith. General Order number 8 is also hereby revoked, and the military tribunals created pursuant thereto are hereby dissolved. Pursuant to Article 17, Section 2, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution, all proclamations, orders, decrees, instructions, acts promulgated, issued and done by the incumbent president, constitute part of the law of the land and shall remain valid, legal, binding, and effective even after the lifting of martial law, unless modified, revoked, superseded, or altered by subsequent proclamations, orders, decrees, instructions, or other acts of the incumbent president, or unless expressly and explicitly modified or repealed by the National Assembly or the Batasan Pambansa. In witness hereof, I have set my hand and caused the seal of the Republic to be affixed on the 17th day of January 1981. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone, to our special edition of the ND Line Online School today in commemoration of martial law. Our topic today is the struggle against the Marcos fascist dictatorship. And we, just before the break, we learned more about the first quarter storm and the EDSA uprising, for example, through Tito Joe. So one of the questions we received from the audience is, what happened in the direct aftermath of the EDSA uprising?
Well, Marcos had to be flown out of the presidential palace by U.S. helicopters. After that, an assembly was convoked in which Aquino was proclaimed as the real winner in the presidential snap election. And she was proclaimed as the presidential successor. So she became the president of the Philippines as a result of Marcos going out of his palace and being brought out of the country by his former U.S. sponsors.
So,
well, there were other outcomes. For instance, a new set of leaders take over, headed by Aquino. So she had to form her cabinet, and then with regard to victims of human rights violations, like those who were still in prison, we were all released, no? Um, I was one of the 5 last to be released, no? Practically all were already released, but it was only on March 5 that I was released, no? And Aquino would issue her own proclamation nullifying all the martial law proclamations of Marcos, including those proclamations and orders which created and put into effect military commissions. And all those charges made against the political prisoners were invalidated, no? So that's how they were released en masse. So I was a beneficiary of this nullification of the martial law proclamations of Aquino. It was a way of rehabilitating legally her own husband, who was convicted and then who would be finally assassinated by the Marcos regime.
Salamat. And our next question is, you talked about international solidarity earlier. My question is, did it play a significant role in the ending of the Marcos fascist dictatorship?
It did. It did. It contributed a lot to the isolation of Marcos, to his eventual overthrow. The world over, Marcos became discredited like Idi Amin or Mobutu of Zaire, no? So he was totally discredited, not only in the Philippines but also abroad. And of course, the National Democratic Movement was ahead in developing the international solidarity movement against Marcos. But then, when Aquino was released in 1981, when he had this heart problem, and then the U.S. told Marcos to release Aquino, otherwise the death of Aquino in prison would be his own liability. So Aquino was released, and so the anti-Marcos movement headed by Aquino became strong, no? So there was a united front between the National Democratic Movement and abroad and the pro-Aquino movement, which was also anti-Marcos. There was a united front, although there was no written formal united front agreement, but I described the alliance as something informal and objective, no? That was the case, because Aquino was playing it safe, no? He was a conservative leader prospected to replace Marcos, and he would enjoy U.S. support with regard to his plan to replace Marcos peacefully, no? And that's why when Marcos was already in economic and political trouble, he was hurrying to the Philippines, and he even gave signals to Marcos that he could be a replacement for him, and in a conciliatory way. But then Marcos was too greedy, and the people around him were too greedy and violent. No? They could not let Aquino return, and so they prepared for his assassination. No, right there in front of the eyes of the world. No, and they tried to do a David Copperfield magic. No, so they got a Galman, no, to be shaped up as the assassin, no. But Galman was already killed, no? Before he was thrown to the tarmac, no, and that was supposed to be timed with the shooting of the head of Aquino on the stairway, and then Aquino would be thrown to the tarmac, no. So anyway. It was a magic show, David Copperfield's style, which can be analyzed, no, and it was clear, no, it was murder, and so no, that Aquino had his own powerful following, no, in terms of solidarity, of course, in a bourgeois liberal way, no, but at the same time you have the progressive, very progressive anti-imperialist progressive movement of the National Democrats in different countries of the world, in the U.S., Europe, even in China, no, at the time, and in many other countries, including Africa and Latin America.
Nice. So to keep with the international theme, so the 1970s were known to be the period of uprising and resistance in various parts of the world. Did it also hearten the resistance of the Filipino people to fight against the Marcos dictatorship? And if so, in what way?
Yung 1970s daw po maraming uprising sa ibang bansa. Nakaapekto daw po ba yun dun sa Pilipinas?
Oh, yes, certainly. U.S. policy was to put up authoritarian regimes, and where they were either being put up or being opposed by many people, So in the 1970s, Allende became president of Chile through elections. He was a socialist political leader and supported by the Communist Party, And the U.S. Overthrew him in a very brutal way. And then I would be very much aware of what happened to him, because I was reminded of it when Marcos said, "Oh, why don't you give up the armed struggle?" When Marcos talked to me when I was arrested. "Why don't you follow Allende? You can stop the armed struggle and go for legal struggle, and you yourself can become president." He was flattering me, but the son of a gun. But I told the rascal Marcos said, "Oh, but he was killed by the military and by the U.S." He did not mention that fact. Well, anyway, the 1970s was a turbulent decade. The U.S. war of aggression in Vietnam was going on. The U.S. would be defeated only in 1975, and the Cultural Revolution in China was going on, and there was turbulence in practically, especially in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, because of U.S. Acts of intervention by the U.S. or people rising up against the acts of intervention and aggression by the U.S.
So is it true that Marcos used the labor export policy as part of suppressing the revolution?
Well, the labor export policy was started during the time of Marcos. You see, it went this way. Marcos was borrowing a lot of money for infrastructure projects, and he was stealing a lot from those projects. And then the loans for infrastructure under the World Bank would become scarce. No, by 1979, the neo-Keynesian policy of releasing money for infrastructure projects would dwindle. But at the same time, the U.S. Was going to recycle, was already in the process of recycling what they call the petrodollars, no? Deposits of the oil-producing countries in the Western countries. So the U.S. Pushed construction projects in the Middle East, no? And so the construction projects of the construction firms like CDCP, one of several crony firms of Marcos in construction, were aiming for contracts in the Middle East, no? So Filipino workers, construction workers, could be there, no? At the same time, well, this was the biggest magnet for at that time for Filipinos to go out of the country. That was, but then eventually that would not count much in preserving the Marcos regime economically. The incomes of the workers, including the construction firms owned by Marcos cronies, could not bring in enough income. And you know, at the time also, right there in the Philippines, this so-called export processing zones were initiated, but that's not a part of your question. But anyway, it was those economic and those export processing zones were supposed to employ more people, but they were just, you know, zones for smuggling, bringing in finished components to be reassembled and so on. They did not employ so many, really. So the slogan then was for exporting labor, and that has been a process that has gone on until it became larger, a larger phenomenon up to the present time. You know, the start was made by Marcos, and this would reach up to 10 to 12 overseas Filipino workers. And they have been sending a lot of money. Yeah, the earnings of the overseas contract workers have weighed so much to buoy up the economy. In addition to loans to cover budgetary and trade deficits and imbalances in the balance of payments. So, but then of course the crisis of overproduction in the world capitalism has gone bad, no? Very bad. It's become so bad. Neoliberalism is cracking up, unraveling, and then you have the aggravation by COVID-19. So many people who went abroad to get jobs, they're in danger. And then, of course, with anyway, so this sending out the people to abroad shows how bad the Philippine economy is. It cannot employ its own labor force. Those who have to get jobs abroad cannot be employed. They should be considered unemployed, no? Within the reckoning of the Philippines. They are, of course, they are recognized as for bringing in foreign exchange, but these Filipinos, the Filipinos who go out to work, I suppose, would prefer to stay on in their own country, if only their country were not being robbed of so much social wealth by those who are in power. They would rather wish that the factories and other workplaces are developed in the Philippines, and they don't have to separate themselves from their own country and from their own families. So that is the export of labor is a necessity. At the same time, it is some kind of a punishment by the monopoly bourgeoisie on those people being forced to go out of their country to work. And it goes, and that's very cheap labor compared to the labor of the host workers. Uh, it is some kind of a replacement of the old colonial system in which the colonial powers and imperialist powers took advantage of people right there in their own colonies, but because of decolonization this time, the poor people in the underdeveloped countries are brought out of the country to be exploited in other countries. So it's an extension of the old colonial system.
Yes, that's true. So we've heard of the gruesome stories of martial law. It still bewilders the youth how people could have been that violent and merciless. Why do you think martial law brought out the worst side of people?
Well, I think as it was in the time of Marcos, so is it now in the time of Duterte. When you have the military unleashed against the people, military officers are trained to bully, uh, haze, and kill people. No, even when they're in training in the Philippine Military Academy, they use feudal and fascist practices. The upperclassmen would bully the lower classmen, and violence would be promoted, would be developed among them. So you have this this kill mentality. So if you let these animals, these monsters rule society, and you have a civilian who is hungry for power and who thinks he's a strong man, is actually a coward. Marcos and Duterte are cowards. If they had no military instruments, they would not be able to kill so many. But having come to power, being able to command the military and the police, they look so brave. They like to boast of themselves as strong men. So they kill their opponents, and they use their military and police power to rob their own rivals within the exploiting class. Yeah? Um, uh, Look at Duterte imitating Marcos. He wants to build up the telecom of his dummy Dennis Oy, dito telecommunity. So he closes down the ABS-CBN the same way that the same thing that Marcos did. So that's how useful brutality is. Oppression always serves exploitation. There is no other motivation for um, for uh, for oppression if not exploitation. And exploitation is necessary to keep down the exploited people. So there is an interrelation between brutality and greed for accumulation of wealth. There is always a necessary connection between oppression and exploitation. Now, let us say, have someone from the lower levels of the exploiting class, or even from the middle class, who has a mindset of joining the upper ranks, and he uses the electoral and political system to rise up. No, if his objective is to gain wealth, and that is the acme of success for that for that politician, then you have a Marcos. Marcos came actually from the middle class family, no, and his father came from a rich peasant family. He was able to finish agricultural. He became an agriculturist and became a lawyer, but he was a failure in the political competition. And the mother had to work as a school teacher, although her father was a small landlord. So Marcos belonged to the right to that social stratum. Who knows how rich are some relatives, and some friends, schoolmates. They know the advantages of being in the upper class, and so they use political power. They become bureaucrat capitalists. And so in order to in order to gain so much beyond the norms, they have to break the norms. They have to become fascist dictators, and they have to go to beyond. They have to go beyond constitutional limits of tenure, and they have to find a way. Since the society is in crisis, as much as the revolutionaries cite the crisis as a reason for the people to make revolution, these bastards, these monsters, also use the same thing as the reason for taking extraordinary measures and for becoming authoritarian and despotic. That's the case. And
yes. So what do you think would have happened if there had been no armed revolution during martial law?
Well, Marcos would have proceeded because, the chronic crisis of the semi-colonial and semi-feudal system was there even before the Communist Party of the Philippines and New People's Army. I would already hear from the so-called nationalist ghost writers of Marcos, because they happen to be university friends. I came to know that they were already plotting. Marcos was already plotting as early as 1960, as early as 1965. As soon as he became president, Marcos was already contemplating on becoming authoritarian. Of course, at first he tried to pose himself as he tried to posture as a nationalist, to fight imperialism. The same thing Duterte pretended to be. He would like to become the first left and socialist president. That was also Marcos. He contrasted himself with Macapagal, who was responsible for the control, and he was known to be so much pro-US, And now, especially among intellectual circles, the word would go around, oh, Marcos is nationalist and so on. So he would like to stretch the limits of power in order to fight the US, something like that, But actually, the objective is to gain power, extraordinary power, in order to enrich himself. And that's what he did. So Marcos is a person, is a coward. He takes advantage, of wrong things that he did, So he murdered Nalundasan. Of course, Nalundasan humiliated the father of Marcos, by parading a coffin, Marcos, after Mariano Marcos was already defeated. But Marcos killed, it was murder. Marcos killed Nalundasan. And then he was able to get off the hook. And then during, Marcos was not a real guerrilla fighter. Of course, he was in the fight in Bataan. But when he was extricated from the concentration camp in Batas, he was already a double agent for the US and the Japanese. When he was extricated by Laurel, and then when the war ended, he wanted to make money. He invented Maharlika regiment, which was imaginary. He wanted to collect millions of dollars, but of course there were many American military officers who knew who were the real guerrillas. But anyway, that's the character of Marcos. He wanted to have power and the force in order to be able to acquire and accumulate wealth. So, and that's the kind of character that you find in Duterte. He capable of saying anything in order to deceive people. But the point is for him to accumulate power and wealth. That's the reason And the worst kind of bureaucrat capitalists are represented by, are personified in Marcos and Duterte. These are monsters even by bourgeois standards. No, they would murder to get their ill-gotten money.
Yes. The next question would be, how did the mass organizations continue organizing despite the very grave danger of being an activist and organizing during martial law?
Indeed, to become an activist, especially above ground, to act legally, that's very dangerous. But of course, if you don't just act like a lone ranger and you keep on shouting and with only your shadow as your following, then you are putting yourself in grave danger, and no one would support you when you get into trouble. A social activist, I went through I speak of my example. No? I came from the 1950s when it was dangerous just to be accused of being a communist, because there was the anti-subversion law, and the penalty was death if you are known to supposedly belong to the Communist Party or any of its extension, successor, or whatever, no? Or if you just, let's say, believe in Marxism, Leninism, you're in trouble. And it takes only 2 witnesses to establish that you are a communist or a subversive. Okay? So what you do is to develop, to have your own study group before before you mount a platform and proclaim yourself as an opponent of the monster, of the monstrous regime. Make sure you have a study group to start with. So there are people whom you work with, and then you consider this only as a cell, a seed, and you multiply the cells. You after the study by a group, then you have a group of determined people to organize other people. You have mass organizations, and the Constitution says you have the right to organize, right, speak out, and assemble. No, so you have your program is very reasonable and just. No, and then you mobilize. By the time that you have the organizations, you mobilize. When you have so much following already, then or as your following grows, in terms of arousing, organizing, and mobilizing the people, we would be a harder nut to crack by the fascists. And you have such a thing as strategy and tactics. No? You take up issues that that serve most people, and the fascists would only be exposed. And then you must have the readiness to go underground if they identify you as what they call a hardcore element. Then also be prepared to go underground when the time comes. But then you have already so many that are already inspired to follow your path, even in the legal struggle. And then you bring along so many to the underground and down to the revolutionary armed, to the People's War. Then you are really difficult to fight, no? You see, in my case, as soon as a knife attack was made on me on February 1968, that fully convinced me that I really had to go underground. So, and it takes several forms of struggle. It takes several forms of struggle because, sometimes a monstrous regime, even if fascist, sometimes make pretensions depending on a certain period. it tries to invoke the Constitution before it changes the terms of the Constitution. So you have so much space. And then they also calculate, they measure their steps. And so you do the corresponding steps. There's such a thing as strategy and tactics. And you have a program of People's Democratic Revolution, for instance. But to apply that, you have to have strategy and tactics that it takes into account different forms of struggle, legal and non-legal. And at the same time, in each form of struggle, there are certain principles and rules to follow. Naturally, if you're in the legal struggle, you have to do things according to the Constitution, according to the law. But the content is to serve the best national and democratic interests of the people. And your enemy will only be embarrassed if he will use forcible action against you, no? And if he uses forcible action, you have some place to go where the strategy and tactics are different. It means, fighting the enemy in the worst way he can fight you. In other words, you must be ready for the highest form of struggle, because that is the form of struggle that determines what kind of society will there be. What kind of state and society there shall be to replace the existing oppressive and exploitative one.
Yes, exactly. So, how did the Filipino compatriots help in the ouster of Marcos, and how will the new generation of Filipino immigrants help in the downfall of Duterte?
Well, the experience of the Filipino people, there are still many who have survived. No, long after the death of Marcos, they have survived and they relate their experience. So it's a good thing that we had a human rights case filed in the U.S. that served to document, the crimes of Marcos, crimes in violation of human rights. We won the case. So that's documented. And there are also the other cases documented some other way, not necessarily for making claims for compensation, but anyway, it's undeniable. The Marcoses with their troll armies try to change history. No, the problem with the movement is so far it has not punished all the beneficiaries of Marcos. No. And they are still making a comeback to power. And they hope with the collaboration of Duterte, they can come back to power. No, that's the problem. But I think the revolutionary struggle will develop, and the struggle will so heat up in the long run that all these monsters and their beneficiaries will be punished as a matter of justice. So there are those who were victimized by the Marcos regime. They're still alive, and so they know how bad Duterte has already violated human rights and how far he can go further. As a matter of fact, they can make comparisons can be made. Some people are already making comparisons. Marcos was documented to have killed 3,257 people. No. That's documented in the case against Marcos in the U.S. judicial system. But Duterte, speaking alone of his victims in the bogus war on illegal drugs, he has killed more than 30,000, and he has started to apply the Oplan Tokhang methods on social activists and critics. Although, of course, it would be more difficult for Duterte to kill 10,000, even only 10,000 of people who come from the middle class, people who can complain. No, Duterte, as a coward, has been able only to kill poor people whom he calculates to be unable to complain. But even then, there are so many human rights organizations in the Philippines and abroad who have been complained, but of course, families of those poor people cannot complain, and so Duterte and his fellow verdugos had practically got away with murder. But of course, people collect their grievances against the regime. And so the comparisons made, recollections of Marcos' dictatorship and comparisons with the ongoing monstrosities and human rights violations being made by Duterte are useful. People are forewarned. We had such a monster before, and we have a Marcos wannabe, a monster who plays by the Marcos playbook. And if he's allowed to, it's a good thing that he's sickly enough. No, and he was already old when he became president. No, and so those who his loyalists cannot think of him as a forever guy. Someone who will stay long in power. As a matter of fact, around Duterte, his loyalists, especially the military now, are stealing money like mad. No, because they know that Marcos Duterte will not stay too long, and Duterte himself knows that he's sickly, and he's also quick at making money on the COVID-19 pandemic, stealing ayuda money and money for the medical solution of the problem. So, and making money from dolomite crushed. Its supposed value is only 28 million pesos, and then they say it's 289 million pesos for a 500-meter long beachfront, along Manila Bay. So you see all these thieves, these plunderers, they're working so fast. And so I say Duterte doesn't appear too much, either because he's really very sick or he's busy counting his money with his accountants and investment counselors who are putting away his money in stocks and bank deposits abroad, in the Cayman and elsewhere. So that's the kind of leaders that you have. The worst are, of course, the Marcos and Duterte type. These are monsters who have appeared in Philippine history to make clear to the Filipino people that we have a ruling system that allows such monsters to ride roughshod over the people.
Yes, exactly. So we've reached our last question, and it's Tagalog naman. So may nasabi kayo sa isang webinar na nasa 110 ang guerrilla fronts. Nasa 73 provinces ang NPA out of 81 provinces. Ang tanong ko po, bakit parang walang mataginting na atake ang NPA katulad ng raid sa PMA? Saka, bakit po buhay pa rin ang mga malalaking mandarambong at malalang mga human rights violators sa bayan natin?
Ayan nga, napansin ko nga rin yung sinabi mo sa tanong. At na mismong ilang kababayan ko na nasa militar, nasa kabila. Ba't NPA, kung talagang ganyan kalakas sila, ba't hindi nila nagagawa ito ganyan, So, they themselves say, bakit hindi napaparusahan yung mga mandaramo kasi sa loob ng militar, may mga yung may pro Duterte, meron naman yung kontra sa mga sip-sip at kay Duterte, So, there are such military officers who think na if only kasi they would like Duterte to be overthrown, just like the military officers that wanted Marcos to be overthrown. So they talk that way. But yung NPA, kung talagang 110 guerrilla fronts yan, bawat guerrilla front isang sundalo lang matodas yan, ang laki na, isang company, bawat isang sundalo lang bawat guerrilla front, every month isang company yan. Todas. Pagkatapos, yung death benefits yan, laki, mawawala, I mean to say, yung gastos ng gobyerno, bibigat, So, At saka yung mga plunderer. Bakit walang nangyayari? Parang wala ng armed city partisans, no? Nung araw meron. So they make demands, and I think the more ordinary people make such demands. I think itong sinasabi ko, observation ko lang ito in general. Ang tagumpay ng kilusang revolusyonaryo ay nakalatag na sa buong Pilipinas, 110 guerrilla fronts sa 73 provinces. Ang kailangan na lang yung magigiting at mga maparaan na commander. Silang silang sisira silang gagawa ng mga opensiba na matindi. Just to take to pursue a bit of accounting, di ba? Kung 110 guerrilla fronts, di bawat buwan katiting na casualty lang isa sa isang guerrilla front, isang company bawat buwan. 12 companies isang taon, that amounts already to how many? At least 3 to 4 battalions na yun. Matinding reduction sa kalaban. At dumami na yung gamit. No? Ganon din yung pagdami ng gamit yung baril na sa kamay ng revolusyonaryo. Ayun, we are talking in hypothetical terms. May obserbasyon yan. Kapag tinitira yung mga kriminal na nasa kapangyarihan, yung mga magnanakaw at mga mamamatay tao na nasa syudad, mapipilitan ngayon yung militar na mapako sa syudad. Mababawasan yung puwersa sa kanayunan. Kaya yung nasa kanayunan, pwede silang mag-commando team para yung mapuwersa yung kalaban nila na mapako sa urban area. Mababawasan yung puwersang mapupunta sa Kasi yan, magiging bodyguards na lang ng mga politiko. Yung mga they're forced to take to do bodyguard duty and forced to be on the defensive. Yon. I suppose naman dahil sa mahabang experience sa mga lumalaban nasa larangan, palagi ko naman nakukwenta nila yon kung paano nila talunin yung kalaban. At saka ang kalaban, yung halimbawa, yung mga kalaban may mga may mga vehicle, may mga power plants ng kanilang mga asyenda. Posporo lang yan Posporo lang. Yung nakikita ko sa ilang rally sa abroad, kung saan matindi yung bakbakan, mga demonstrador, pag tumira yung mga pulis at militar, yung mga sasakyan sumisiklab, nasisindihan. So, hindi ko pa nakita sa Pilipinas yan, yung lumiliyab yung mga sasakyan ng mga pulis. Ibig sabihin, sobrang bait ng mga puwersang lumalaban sa diktadura sa Pilipinas. Pero aabutin yan kasi ang nagdidikta yung nauuna yung diktadura, yung mga pasista sa paggamit ng dahas. At sila na rin yung parang best teacher. By negative example, they're the best teacher to the revolutionary forces. The revolutionary forces know exactly what to do because in the first place, nakikita nila kung ano yung pamamaraan ng kalaban nila para supilin yung masa.
Salamat, Tito Joe. So, this is our chikahan for today. Yes. Thank you again and see you next week and see hopefully all of you again next week.
Salamat din, Edna. At salamat sa ating mga tagapakinig. Inaasahan natin na sa ikatlong webinar sa serye natin, ano yon, makikinig, lalahok sila muli at tapusin nila. At yung masasabi nila na meron silang buong kalaman tungkol sa diktadura ni Marcos at itong wannabe na diktadura ni umaandar na diktadura ni itong isa pang bagong halimaw na si Duterte. So umaasa ko na yung anumang kaalaman na makukuha nila sa ating webinar series, may apply nila sa kanilang pagkilos. Pabuhay kaliban.
Ating hinahanap ang wastong paglalapat ng pamumuno at pagkapal sa masang bumabalikwas. Narito tayo para sa pagkakaisa, pagsulong. Narito tayo para sa pagwawasto, pagkaluyong. Narito tayo para ang kalat-kalat na gulo magiging muod na buo. Pagkakaisa, paglaban, tagumpay sa ating bayan ay ambag sa daigdigan. Paglaya ng sangkatauhan. Narito tayo para sa pagkakaisa, pagsulong. Narito tayo para sa masangabing Pilipino. Narito tayo para ang kalat-kalat na gulo magiging muog na buo. Narito tayo para sa pagkakaisa, pagsulong. Narito tayo para sa masangabing Pilipino. Narito tayo para ang kalat-kalat